Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on this beautiful day. Uh, I hope you'll maybe get a chance to go out later and get a little walk in since it's so nice today. Again, thanks for joining us. My name is Matt Gagel. I am the Director of Programs at Montgomery History, and we're glad you're here. I'd like to give a special thank you to all who have made donations to our Save Your Voices campaign. We are working to preserve our oral history collection, our records, our tapes. They are tapes. Our oral history tapes. Many of them are on cassette tape. Some of them are on reel-to-reel. We are hoping to get as many of those transferred onto modern storage methods with multiple backups as possible as part of our spring appeal. So if you have not yet given, you can visit our website and click on the Save Our Voices button. That'll take you to a page where you can hear some audio samples of some local residents who are share their stories and help oral histories are unique in that they help preserve local dialects and unique aspects of local culture that just aren't always recorded in print. So if you would like to make a donation, you can visit our website. You can click on the Donate Now button and select the Spring Appeal Save Our Voices campaign. Or like I said, there's a big button, big banner image where you can click and hear some samples and learn a little bit more about what we hope to do with your support. So again, thanks to those who have made a donation, and we do appreciate that. Next week, we'll have a rewind. It is Eid, the end of Ramadan. So we want to show a recording. It actually is, I didn't realize this when I scheduled it. It didn't quite go through my mind. It's actually a panel discussion that was led by James Johnston, who is speaking today. So you get a double dose of Jim. So that'll be available next Monday. That's a presentation on the Muslim experience in Montgomery County from the 2018 History Conference. So again, that'll be available for 1 week on our website at montgomeryhistory.org/mhconnected/watch. During the presentation, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A button. Those will come to me, and we will do a Q&A time period at the end, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Jim told me this was a little bit longer presentation, so I hope you'll stick around and ask as many questions as you would like. Again, we'll get to as many as we can within reason. I don't want to keep you here forever, but okay. That's all from me. And nobody came to listen to me talk, but we'll hand things over to Jim here. I'm going to stop my share. And Jim, you are ready to start whenever you would like.
All right, thank you. And I need to share my screen, and which I will do right now.
Okay, yeah, and it did mute you again. So let me try that. Let's see if that works.
I got it.
There you go. Okay. Yep. I can hear you.
All right. James Alexander, and thank you, Matt, and thank everybody for tuning in on this beautiful day. This is in several parts, and the origin of it is a book I did on Yarrow Mammoth, and James Alexander Simpson was one of the painters who painted his portrait. So I learned a little bit about Simpson then, and then more recently, I wrote an article for White House History Magazine specifically about James Alexander Simpson as one of the artists in Washington in the early days. But today I'm going to go a little bit broader, and I'm going to talk about the portrait artists generally who were in the Washington area, and then go into Simpson and sort of the background of that. Let me first show you James Alexander Simpson. Born in Frederick, Maryland in 1805, died in Baltimore in 1880. This is a self-portrait he did. Some of his collateral descendants are tuning in today, so I won't say anything bad about him. And they, in fact, donated this portrait to Georgetown University. It was in the family until fairly recently. But before I get into his biography, I'm going to do two things. First of all, talk about the fact that he was he's called a primitive painter and what that means. And I'm going to show you what that means. It means an untrained artist. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the Washington art environment in which he started painting, which was about 1820. So let me first begin with this thing of primitive American artists versus those trained in Europe. And primitive, again, means someone who was not trained. And, Europe, the art status of art in Europe was vastly ahead of what it was in the United States in early times. Artists didn't want to travel across the Atlantic, risking the perilous ocean voyage just to get over here, because the only people buying paintings were wealthy planters or merchants. And there wasn't a big demand for art here as there was in Europe. And so there were very few European painters here. Certainly no quality European painters came to America in the early days. So everybody had to be homegrown. And when I talk about paintings, I'm mainly focusing on portraits. Engraving was available, so if you wanted a landscape, you could get an engraving. But the big demand for paintings, of course, was portraits of people, of the family. And it was only the rich planters and merchants that could afford those. So let's start with the early painters. Oh, here's a guy named William Johnston. I came across this in a magazine, in a newspaper, and couldn't help include it in this. I am a terrible artist, but apparently someone in my family many centuries ago was a painter. And in this last line, it says this, he's a runaway indentured servant. It says that he goes by the trade of a painter, limner, and glazier. A limner, Limner, is a portrait painter. That was a word for in those days. So this guy runs away, but people as humble as a indentured servant were running around doing paintings to make money if they could. But he's not really so much in the business, and there's no record of him other than this runaway. But the earliest really known portrait painter was John Singleton Copley. And this is a self-portrait he did. And you can see he's pretty good. He was trained a little bit. His father ran away to the West Indies and apparently died. And so his mother remarried an engraver who did have training. And so Copley did learn from his stepfather the trade and got improved. But, he was an innately talented guy. He did this portrait, for example, of Paul Revere. And you can see Copley's doing some interesting things here. It's a little fleshy, probably not a great likeness, but he's got the reflection on the table, and he's got a reflection in this kettle or whatever Paul Revere is holding. So he's pretty good. I mean, this is better than anybody else is doing at that time. But then Paul Revere decided that he could make more money in Europe. And so he packed his bags and went to Europe and never came back. And he learned a lot in Europe. And for example, this painting of Watson and the shark is much more advanced than anything that was going on in America. I just saw this 2 weeks ago at the National Gallery of Art. It's, even though it was painted in London, it is back here in the United States. And see, this is a very advanced bit of painting. And you can see that this is based on an incident where a guy gets attacked by a shark in Havana Harbor. And the reason he paints it is because it's in all the newspaper. So that's Copley. Another early artist is Benjamin Blyth, and he's more typical. This is an ad he took out in the Salem Gazette. He begs leave to inform the public that he's opened a room for the performance of limning in crayon. So he's doing portraits in crayon. And he's in his house, his father's house, and in Salem. And so you can go there and get your portrait done. He'll have samples for you to look at. And this is the way these early portrait painters were making their money, by putting ads in papers and having studios in their house. But it's in crayon, and here's a sample of what he did. John Adams. As you can see, this is pretty crude. Bear in mind it's in crayon, but all the same, it's pretty crude. there's no art to it. It's more like a craft, and probably John Adams here doesn't look a whole lot different than Sam Smith would look if Blyth did one of him. Blyth ultimately moved to Williamsburg and got into oil paintings as well. So you can see this is the early state, and this is what we call a primitive painting. And then there were others running around. There was John I keep mispronouncing his name, Hesselius. His father was trained in Sweden and came over, and so he trained his son John. And John did this portrait of 5-year-old Charles Calvert with his slave. And this is pretty getting better. And Hesselius did a lot of paintings in the Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia area. But it also tells us a new fact about these painters. This subject, this 5-year-old and the slave, are not coming to the studio. Hesselius is going out to the Calvert plantation and painting there. And that was the way most of the painters did their work in those days. They were itinerant. They would live in a city, but they'd have to travel around because there simply weren't enough wealthy people in a city to support them. Here's another artist that is in the Washington area, Francis Guy. He did not paint portraits, but he was in the Baltimore area. This particular painting is of Brooklyn, but you can see he's good. And that's the standout part, is he's a good painter. Of course, no one is going to buy a portrait or a painting of Brooklyn if they live in Maryland. I mean, there's no reason to hang this on your wall. So he wasn't doing a whole lot. He's not very famous in the area, but I was impressed with the quality of his work. Another one who was doing a lot more paintings was Joshua Johnson, and you can see he did the McCormick family. This is again in Baltimore. Joshua Johnson was African American, and in fact, he had been a slave. And once he was freed, he was doing these portrait paintings, and he did quite a few of them. You can see he's not very good, but this is what you got if you were an early Marylander and you wanted your family portrait done or your portrait done. It'd be the wealthy planter, his wife, or his children, depending on what they did. Then there was this guy living up in Pennsylvania named Benjamin West, and he had some artistic talent. And in 1756, his friends convinced him to do the death of Socrates. And I guess that was pretty common thing. Everybody knew about the death of Socrates. I imagine there were engravings around, there were writings about it. So Benjamin West did this portrait, and he entered it into a competition and won. And you can see it's pretty good. I mean, he's doing interesting things with the building, but the faces are pretty crude. But he won a prize for this. 2 years later, Benjamin West did a self-portrait miniature, and this is what he looked like on the miniature. It's not a whole lot better than that John Adams portrait by Benjamin Blyth, but this is Benjamin West's self-portrait. But he decides at this point that there are bigger fish to fry, and there's a world waiting for him in Europe. And so he left, never to return, and went to Europe, went down to Italy and toured all of Europe, Paris, Rome, Venice, seen all the art in Europe. And he ended up in London studying under, well-known painters. And in 12 years later, 1770, this is what he did in 1758. This is his self-portrait in 1770. And you can see the dramatic difference between what he did in the United States and what he did after he saw Europe. He also did some later paintings of him, Agrippina landing at Brundisium with the ashes of Germanicus. This is hot on everybody's mind as a topic, but he is certainly advanced with the light, the shadows, the background, focusing your attention. So he's very advanced by this point. And he ultimately became the portrait painter for King George III, the man we fought in the American Revolution. Now we come to the Washington, D.C. painters. Well, and that is, for example, Gilbert Stuart. His painting of George Washington is on the dollar bill. Gilbert Stuart, like others you're going to hear about, went to London and studied under Benjamin West. So here we have George Washington painted by a man who was studying under Benjamin West, who was the king's portrait painter. So we have somebody painting both sides of the American Revolution. My favorite by Gilbert Stuart, and Gilbert Stuart came to Washington, D.C., lived in Washington, D.C. for 2 years. Bear in mind, Washington, D.C. didn't become a capital city until 1800. And in that period of time, Gilbert Stuart spent 2 years working here, but ultimately went other places. But that's his portrait of George Washington. And this is my favorite. It's the skater. You can see this is, compared to what I was showing you with primitives, this is very, very advanced painting. This also is at the National Gallery of Art, but it's not on display at the moment. Another artist who studied under Benjamin West is Charles Bird King. He did live in Washington. He came here in 1820, and he spent the rest of his life here. He had a studio in Washington and a gallery. His gallery was sort of the centerpiece for the art community in Washington. There were not museums there. It was Charles Bird King's gallery that you went to. This is a painting of Pawnee Chief in 1822. I won't attempt to pronounce his name, but these Indian chiefs were brought to the White House to meet the president. And then when they were finished there, the government would urge them to go down to Charles Bird King's studio, and it paid him to paint their portraits. So he has a series of portraits of Indian chiefs. And again, this is a man trained under Benjamin West, and he was the dominant painter at the time James Alexander Simpson was painting. A real primitive, though, was George Washington Parke Custis. He is the step-grandson of George Washington. George Washington married Martha Custis. She had children, George didn't, and this is her grandson. He owned the Custis Lee Mansion, which we now call Arlington Cemetery. His sister, Martha Peter, owned Tudor Place in Georgetown. So these were very, very wealthy, very, very fashionable people in early Washington. And Parke Custis, that's what he's usually called, was doing paintings. He was also a playwright, and they perform his plays. They were dreadful. His paintings weren't a whole lot better. He had these very romantic themes, and this was the Battle of Trenton and Princeton. These were battles that his step-grandfather had fought in, and you can see, I'm not very good. I couldn't do it this well, but I could sort of, when I was younger, I could come close to this. This hangs at the Custis Lee Mansion, but Parke Custis had done a larger portrait of this, and it hung in the Capitol because of his name, Parke Custis, Washington in his name. And finally, the Capitol asked him to remove it. They were unhappy with it. And I guess he got so ticked off, he sent his servant to pick it up and told the servant to throw it into the Potomac. So the big painting is lost. But this is, again, another primitive. At the same time, James Alexander Simpson is doing painting. And one last one I want to show you is Baroness de Neuville, who was the wife of the French ambassador. This is a self-portrait she did in charcoal and crayon. She was not painting for money, but she was painting scenes of Washington, D.C. in the early days. Here's another she did of St. John's Church from the third floor of the Decatur House. St. John's Church is right across from the White House. This is Lafayette Park here. So, we do have these images she was doing, which brings me to James Alexander Simpson. His first portrait was the one I came across of Yarrow Mammoet, done in 1822. And you can see he's a primitive. Simpson is not a great painter. It's pretty photographic. He's got some things down right. And I'm going to come back to this painting in just a minute. A little bit more about Simpson is that he was born in 1805. There are records of him at Georgetown College in 1815. He was paying something, billed for sundries of $73.50. Lynn Conway is the archivist at Georgetown. She put me onto this, and I said, well, why would a 10-year-old be having bills at Georgetown College? And she said, well, there was a curriculum in those days, but if you were not a curriculum student, anyone could go. The college was willing to take your money. Unknown what Simpson was doing, but he had a connection with Georgetown, obviously, at 10 years old. And then finally, one painter that has to be brought in is Charles Willson Peale, who also painted Yarrow Mammoet. And Charles Willson Peale, again, is the typical of these better painters. He started out on his own as a saddle maker. He didn't like that. He became a watchmaker. He got into portrait painting. John Hesselius helped him, did some training to him, but most of it, Peale was a self-made painter. He lived in Annapolis, and he had a studio there. And so when the planters would come in the fall with their tobacco to send to England, he'd get his business. And, they had money in their pocket, and they'd want to get a portrait of himself. But he couldn't make a living just painting 2 months a year. So he, like the rest of them, was an itinerant. And this was his first painting of George Washington. Peale traveled to Mount Vernon, spent 3 or 4 days there. This was the first of 7 life portraits he did of Washington. Washington did not like sitting or standing while he's being painted. And this was about the longest he ever sat for any painting, was this one. But, Peale's there at Mount Vernon, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, staying at Mount Vernon. And so on the night that he left, George thanked him for his work and said, it's too bad that your wife isn't along, and please take this cup back to her in Annapolis as a token of our affection. So Peale got the first souvenir from Mount Vernon, and it was directly from the hands of George Washington. But Peale decided, or his friends decided, he was too good an artist not to go to Europe. So he went to London and spent 2 years under Benjamin West. So not only was he was in London helping paint King George III, and he had already painted George Washington. And when he came back to the United States, the American Revolution broke out, and Charles Willson Peale fought in the Revolution. So he was really sort of saw the Revolution from both sides, but went on to paint Washington and many other people, including John Adams. And I include this only to show you the difference between what Charles Willson Peale could do after studying under Benjamin West and studying in Europe, and what Benjamin Blyth could do with John Adams. This is a much different, a much better painting. So now I want to talk just a short bit about the relationship between Peale's portrait of Yarrow, Mammoet, and Simpson, because this tells us a little bit more about what the art community is like in Washington, D.C. in the 1820s. Here's Peale's portrait. Peale, this is obviously much better, much more artistic. I mean, it's just much higher quality painting. And he took it back. Peale, usually you'd sell these portraits to the man you painted, but with Yarrow, Peale took it back to his museum in Philadelphia. And that was one of the first museums in the United States. It was a for-profit museum. Washington, D.C. did not have museums. On one floor or one hallway, there were these, you can see these birds and wildlife. He had taxidermists with stuffed animals. At one point, he had a mammoth elephant skeleton in the museum, and then he painted his portrait of what a mammoth elephant skeleton would look like. So the patron could see, make all these connections. But he also had a gallery where he had all these portraits, and absolutely convinced that the Yarrow Mammoet portrait that he did in 1819 was here somewhere. And was done by Peale himself. And I keep looking around trying to figure out if any one of those portraits is Yarrow Mammoet, and it's sort of hopeless to do that. But I think, therefore, that what happened was James Alexander Simpson in Washington, D.C., was very interested in portrait painting. And so he wants to see the best painter he can, and that is Charles Willson Peale's museum up in Philadelphia. And so I believe that Simpson went up there and saw the Yarrow Mammoet painting and said, I know that guy. He lives just down the street from me. And so that Simpson then did this painting, seeing it in the museum in Philadelphia. And he was inspired by that portrait to make his own painting of Yarrow Mammoet. On the back of this painting, that painting is the Georgetown Library. It says Yarrow Mammoet painted by Alexander Simpson. Old Yarrow, died from Africa, died in November 1823. It was painted on August, I think that's 3rd or 5th, 1822. Which brings us then to Simpson's meteoric early career. When he painted Yarrow, he was only 17 years old. So this is really something. He's gone to Philadelphia, and there's other reasons I think this Philadelphia's chronology is correct. And I'm about to get those to you. So he's really risen up to early times. But Yarrow dies in 1823, and this is one of his obituaries, but the second sentence says, one of the best likenesses we remember to have seen of anybody was taken of this harmless old man by young Simpson of Georgetown, a youth whose genius entitles him to the patronage of the Friends of Science. You know, I suspect Simpson wrote this obituary, and he's doing it as an ad for himself as much as an obituary to Yarrow. If he didn't write it, some very good friend wrote this and got it in the paper. The next year in 1824 is this next thing we see is a report of a thing called the Columbian Museum. And at that museum, this is a newspaper announcement that some of the editions, one of those editions is the portrait of Yarrow, and that by Mr. Simpson of Georgetown. So we see he now has his painting in a museum in Washington. He also has a portrait of Guinea Sarah, now living upwards of 100 years old, by Simpson. This is, we still have the Yarrow painting. The portrait of Guinea Sarah is lost, and I've searched rather diligently for it. That's a pity, because given her name, she probably came on a slave ship. And if so, this is the only known and lost oil portrait of someone who came to the United States on a slave ship. Now, this Columbian Museum is an interesting thing. It was located down here at 9th and Pennsylvania, where I have this little picture of Yarrow. This was the city market. It's on the second floor of this building here, near where the National Portrait Gallery now stands, the Smithsonian Museum of American Art stand. That was a good place to have a museum, in theory. This museum was started by a man named James Griffiths, and he had been a taxidermist at the Peale Museum in Philadelphia. And he decided that he was going to strike out on his own, and so he came down to Washington, which did not have a museum. So Griffiths is going to open a museum, he calls it the Columbian Museum, and thinks he's going to be as wealthy as Charles Willson Peale from having this museum. And I think that's the reason he got that Simpson portrait of Yarrow, that the portrait of Yarrow had been up in Philadelphia. The Peale portrait was in the Philadelphia Museum and was popular. And so when Griffiths gets down here and is opening a museum, he somehow meets Simpson and gets those portraits from Simpson put into the museum. That's 1824. By the way, the Columbian Museum didn't make it. It closed within a year, by the end of the year. But at the end of that year, too, Lafayette came to town. You know, he fought in the Revolution, American Revolution. He went back to France. The French Revolution occurred. He was incarcerated during parts of the French Revolution. He survived the Napoleon's time. And in 1824, as an older man, he's going to come and take a victory lap in the United States. And that would be a 13-month victory lap. He toured the whole country, starting in Washington, D.C. And the plan was, he had gotten this portrait done by Ari Scheffer, and he was going to present this as his present to the American people. It's now in the House of Representatives collection. He's going to present it at a ceremony at the Capitol building and then parade down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, where he's going to have lunch with President Monroe. And this is where Simpson comes in two ways. First of all, the parade is going to be led by the cadets from Georgetown, cadets sort of like an ROTC unit, and from what was then called Columbia College, which we now call George Washington University. So I'm going to use some modern names. So Georgetown and GW cadets are going to march in the parade, and the paper reports this: no sooner was the order given to advance than the party of the George Washington boys, bearing their flag with a star on it, rushed to the front, and they went by the Georgetown cadets and cut the banner off their little flag. And then that goes on. In an instant, a number of the larger Georgetown boys, seeing what had been done, made a spring at the banner and tore the GW banner down and bore it off. In commemoration of these events, Georgetown had a banner painted by an artist named Simpson, representing on one side an eagle holding in its beak a streamer on which the motto was inscribed, Nemine Sedimus, is my high school Latin. On the reverse side, the coat of arms of the college was placed. So this event where they cut off the flag at the Lafayette parade is still remembered and written about at Georgetown, as is the fact that Simpson then painted a banner. So he's connected with Georgetown in 1824, and he's doing not only portraits of Yarrow Mammoet, but he's doing anything that can take an artist, including this flag. At about the same time, he married the daughter of Carlo Franzoni, who was one of the Italian craftsmen brought over by Benjamin Latrobe to decorate the Capitol. This is Franzoni's car of history clock in the House of Representatives. I show this because, having married the this Italian artist's daughter, Simpson's got to be learning from these Italian artist craftsmen. So he's not completely untrained. He's learning from these Italians. And indeed, by 1825, Simpson's put on the faculty of Georgetown. This is a brochure that's sent out for parents of prospective students telling about the college. Stands on a nice ground. The principal faculty, the academic faculty, were largely Jesuits, but the fine arts teachers were not. And we see Alex Simpson here being a professor of drawing. I note that these other two men are probably Italian. I don't know if they worked on the Capitol, but I know that Vincent Massey was later in the newspapers as teaching dancing, so that's probably what he did. And Francis Massey was a jeweler in Washington, so I think these may have been Italians as well. So Simpson is sort of running with this crowd of artists from Italy and others from Italy, so he's learning those skills, and he's still just 20 years old. He also did this landscape of Georgetown College in the early days. An engraving was made of this and put on the cover of that brochure I just showed you, and it was there for years. And his painting is still at Georgetown College, or now Georgetown University. He was also a copyist, and what you're looking at here was a photograph I took a few weeks ago at the National Gallery of Art. This is a copyist station. They told me that the people who want to make a copy of these paintings in the National Gallery of Art have to get licensed by the gallery, but these copy stations are there, and where they go in and copy artworks. And that's what Simpson did. He was a copyist. In fact, he was perhaps as famous for his copies as for his original art. And so with the Lafayette portrait here, Simpson made a copy, and it is lost. As many Guinea Serra's lost, his copy of this Lafayette painting is lost. It was said that this Lafayette looked at it and said, "Oh my gosh, this is wonderful," and gave Simpson a big hug. I think Lafayette was a politician, and he, of course, is not going to tell Simpson it's ugly, but it supposedly was a good copy. And therefore, it plays this role, and I've got to give you the history of the White House going on here. In 1824, there was a presidential election. Monroe had served 2 terms and was not standing for re-election. John Quincy Adams stood for election and won, and he defeated Andrew Jackson. In 1828, the presidential election was between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson won on the second time. John Quincy Adams was devastated. He was terribly depressed. Both he and his father, John Adams, had been defeated after only 1 term, and he was having to leave the White House. And in those days, the inauguration of the new president was in March. So here is an interesting newspaper account of what happened. Walking into the Senate chamber, the guy who wrote this said, the only person in it was James Alexander Simpson, a limner and portrait painter, making arrangements to sketch the chamber as it appeared on inauguration day. So he's making this painting of the inauguration of Andrew Jackson, which was taking place in the Senate chamber. It wasn't outdoors, it was indoors. This also reports that James Alexander Simpson did the large full-length portrait of Lafayette. That's a copy. And it was the only piece of furniture in the East Room of the President's house, of the White House, on the 1st of January, 1829, on the occasion of Mrs. Adams's last soiree. So the Adamses are having to leave the White House, but on New Year's Day, January 1829, the only thing in the East Room is Simpson's portrait, a copy of the Lafayette portrait. So, he's really hit the big times by 1829. Both of these paintings are lost. But again, there is a very famous painting of the House of Representatives in 1823 by Samuel Morse. And I think this was the inspiration for Simpson to do the inauguration of Andrew Jackson. He knew this was a famous painting, and just like the Yarrow Mammoth painting, he is using some other artist's painting as inspiration for his own. I will say that Samuel Morse also studied under Benjamin West in London, and you may know Samuel Morse because he was one of the many that helped invent the telegraph, and the Morse code is named after him. Now we go on to Simpson's later years. Here he is as a miniature painter and portrait painter, West Street near the corner of High, that would be Wisconsin and P today. And this is 1842. So he's teaching at Georgetown College and taking commission work. He did this miniature of his sister, Anna Sophia Simpson. So you can see more of his work, and her descendants, who I've mentioned earlier, gave me this little sketch he did of Anne's son at age 2. You can see that Simpson is probably a quick and easy artist. He's doing, this is why you would tap him. He's good. He's not great, but he's good. He also did this one of George Shoemaker in 1843, and this bears some time of me to explain this painting. First of all, it's the Georgetown Wharf. That's what we now call Roosevelt Island. In those days, there was a ferry that ran from the island to Georgetown. It was the Mason Ferry. That's the ferry house. You can't see it in this painting, but there are ferry boats there overturned, drying out. This is the Potomac River, the Georgetown Wharf. We see a canal boat back here. the canalman, looking very much like a canalman in his outfit there, brought these probably wheat flour down to Georgetown. George Shoemaker's father was ran the mills in Rock Creek. So he was a miller, and George Shoemaker himself became the flour inspector for Georgetown. And what he would do, in those days, you'd fill these barrels full of flour and ship them over to England or France or up to New York. And certain unscrupulous people, and I would mention one would be George Washington, would fill these things with things other than flour. And George Washington was known to put the moldy flour in the bottom and the good flour at the top. You might put leaves or something in the bottom. So what George Shoemaker is doing here, this is a awl or auger. He would drill this through the top of the barrel, and it was hollow, and he'd push it all the way down the barrel, pull it back up to see that the flour all the way down this barrel was good. So that's what he's doing here. This is some assistant that's got a mallet, and I suspect is plugging these barrels up after they've been drilled. And again, you see African Americans. So Simpson is showing his portraits not only of white guys, rich white guys, but canal boatmen and African American laborers in Georgetown. And finally, again, it's hard to see on this picture. And by the way, this is the National Portrait Gallery, but in storage, not on display. There's a grain of wheat in his hat. And, when I looked at it, my first thought was he's a hayseed. He's also got this dent in his hat, a stovepipe hat. So it's sort of almost comical. And this little dark object here on the real painting, you can see it's a rat. And I thought that this is an editorial comment by Simpson that George Shoemaker is a hayseed and a rat. But this painting was in the family until the about 1990s when it was donated to the National Portrait Gallery. So clearly Shoemaker paid for it, and I don't think he would have paid for a comical painting of himself. It's just the way things were at the time. Simpson is also credited with having done this painting of an African American, Doc Sandy Kenny, a servant of Gustavus Brown Wallace of King George's County, Virginia. That's east of Fredericksburg. He was a body servant to some general in the Revolution, but they didn't know who it was. And we know about this because this painting is now in private hands, in fact, descendants of Wallace. And one of those descendants wrote this letter in 1924 explaining the painting as it was told her by a former slave of the Wallace family. This portrait of Uncle Sandy was taken along with Old Master's family portrait by artists from Washington who lived a long while in their house to complete them. So he's doing just like Charles Willson Peale did and all these itinerant painters did, traveled around, and he would do the whole family while he was there. And they said, go ahead, please do Uncle Sandy. And this is not much about art, but it's very interesting about Uncle Sandy that in the morning, Wallace would come out of the house and he would say to Uncle Sandy, who had the title Doc, "Who is sick today, Doc Sandy? How is Sam?" Kenny, "Nothing tall, martyr with Sam, master. Don't want to work. I give him pill last night. Nothing tall but bread pill. And he say he feels so much better today." And I think this is remarkable. This painting was done in 1844, meaning that even then they were using placebos, and this old former slave who was working with a doctor's family had learned how to give placebos and make people better. Simpson did this portrait of Visitation Academy. It hangs today in Visitation Academy in their auditorium. So he was doing landscapes again. And then there comes these Decatur portraits. Stephen Decatur was the first naval hero in the United States. 1804, he did this remarkable thing in Tripoli, and I won't get into the details, but in the Marine hymn, "From the shores of Tripoli," that's part of that episode. And so he was painted by Gilbert Stuart in 1804. And this is Gilbert Stuart's portrait of Stephen Decatur. But then in 1819, Decatur fought a duel and he was killed in the duel. And his wife moved to Georgetown, apparently met Simpson. And in later years, 1830s, she decided she was going to move her husband's body from Washington to his home in Philadelphia, to the graveyard of his parents in Philadelphia. So she arranged to move the body to Philadelphia. And when she did that, she was going to give Philadelphia this Gilbert Stuart portrait. But when she was doing that, the Society of Cincinnati, in the interim, after Gilbert Stuart painted the portrait, had given Stephen Decatur a medal. So she said to Simpson, I want you, there's been some deterioration in this painting. Would you fix up the painting, mainly the uniform, and would you put this medal on the Gilbert Stuart portrait? So Simpson did, and he made this copy for himself, and he made a total of 4 copies of the Gilbert Stuart painting. So here you see what Gilbert Stuart did of Stephen Decatur, and here you see Simpson's copy, and you can decide for yourself about the quality of Gilbert Stuart versus Simpson's copy. He did the same thing with the Washington family. In 1855, we have this newspaper report in Charlestown, West Virginia. He went out there and he copied 10 portraits that the Washington family had. He was hired by Lewis William Washington. Lewis William was the grandson of George's half-brother. And so he's copying various paintings of Washingtons that were in the possession of the Washingtons out in Charlestown, West Virginia. And once again, we see this commercial at the second paragraph here, the commercial for Simpson. This group, although taken from paintings over 100 years old, are most perfect. They are not only finished in superior style, but are exact likenesses of the parties. They are no fancy portraits, the characteristics of the original being strictly adhered to. Professor Simpson has given an evidence of his talent unsurpassed after an experience of more than 30 years. One of those portraits, of those 10 portraits that were done, it was said, a writer in 1977, a professor at Georgetown, did an article on Simpson. He said that those 10 copies were in the hands of Washington descendants in Baltimore. All of them have been lost except this one. This is a Simpson's copy of a portrait by some unknown artist of Charles Washington. Charles Washington and George's 2 other full brothers, lived in Charlestown, West Virginia. And this was that's how Charlestown got named. And this is of the founder of Charlestown, Charles Washington. But this is Simpson's copy because Charles Washington's home in Charlestown burned down and the original was destroyed. It has been redone. The house has been redone, restored, and Mount Vernon, someone in Baltimore gave Mount Vernon this copy done by Simpson, and it is on loan to the house in Charlestown, West Virginia. This is the only known copy of those 10 Washington portraits. However, I do have, this is an original of Hannah Bushrod Washington that I took a picture of several years ago. She was George Washington's sister-in-law. This is her painting. So there was a copy made of this, and someone sent me this photograph that appeared in a book of of Simpson's copies. So to sum it up, this is the original. This is the copy Simpson made. Simpson's copy would have been in color, but this was a photograph put in some book that a man found and sent me. So you can again see he's doing these copies. Again, this painting is lost. The final losses, though, were Simpson's obituary in 1880. It went through his career. His first wife passed away. He remarried the widow of another artist, moved to Baltimore, and there got into religious paintings. And this article says Part of this obituary says he excelled in historical paintings and has left a number of original scriptural paintings in Baltimore. Of those, one is at the Passionist Monastery opposite London Park Cemetery, the Entombment of Christ. His last picture but one is considered his best effort. So naturally, I went up to find that, but the Passionist Monastery was burned down 3 years after his death, and the painting was destroyed. I even went to St. Martin's Church in Baltimore, where his funeral was, thinking maybe some of these artwork was his. The church has been deconsecrated. I went especially maybe these Stations of the Cross in the Catholic Church, but they're plastic, so that's not Simpson's. So so many of his works are lost. It's hard to judge him. My final painting of his, though, is Mary Ellen Stonestreet Hoffer. Those of you in the Montgomery history know that Dr. Stonestreet is one of our presenters, and Clarence Hickey portrays Dr. Stonestreet. This is a distant cousin of Dr. Stonestreet, and this is Simpson's copy. I mean, this is Simpson's painting of her. But before I finish, I want to finish on one last note, because I want to finish on the note of going around to places and looking at portraits on the wall when you go to museums, old taverns, old houses, and there are portraits on the wall. It's interesting to look at them and try to figure out who the painter was. And one of the most interesting paintings I ever saw was at the Wayside Inn in the Shenandoah Valley, and they had lots of old paintings there. And it was a painting not of a human, but of a dog. And it occurred to me that some itinerant portrait painter went out to this farmer's tobacco planter's place in Shenandoah Valley 150, 200 years ago. And the owner, the man who hired him said, and I'd like you to do my dog. And the portrait painter said, what? And the planter said, I'd like you to do my dog. And the painter said, well, I've never done a dog. And the man says, well, I'll pay you to do the dog. So the portrait painter had never done a dog, but did a pretty fair representation of a dog looking at the side, from the side of the dog, because he could do landscape. But the dog then is looking 90-degree angle. His face is turned a 90-degree angle, looking directly at the viewer. And the dog's face looks like a human. And I think the portrait painter only knew how to do human faces. And so what he did, he drew an oval, and then he drew a dog's face in the oval like he would do a human. And I wish I had kept a copy of that painting. I mean, I wish I'd done a photograph. Here's the Wayside Inn, still there in the Shenandoah Valley. You can see the portraits on the wall, but the dog isn't there. But my point again is, when you go to these places in your history tours, and you don't just ignore the paintings of the wall, go up and see who they are of and possibly who painted them. And there is, if you need help, the Smithsonian Museum of American Art has an inventory of American paintings, and you can go there and get some help. And that is James Alexander Simpson as an early example of artist in early America. And with that, I'll go back to stop my sharing, and in theory, my face will come up on the screen.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim. That was fantastic. Again, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A button. We got a few that have come in here. Someone mentions that older items spelled it as Simpson, S-I-M-S-O-N, rather than Simpson, S-I-M-P-S-O-N. Is there any consistency in that?
No, it was spelled both ways. You know, you have to bear in mind, people couldn't spell in those days. I mean, there weren't dictionaries. You know, anytime you do research back before the invention of the dictionary in America, you're going to find that spellings are all over the place.
Okay. Did Simpson sign his copies, or did he use the name of the original artist, or both?
I have not found, he certainly didn't sign the Yarrow painting. The writing on the Yarrow painting, I think it's most certainly James Griffiths, who hung that in his museum, and no indication that Simpson signed his paintings.
Okay. So someone says they noticed that by 1824, men were wearing long pants. I mean, was there any consistency in, primitive artists, as they're called? Would they tend to paint the entire body, or was it more of like a upper body that would have shown that?
It's a good question. People, both way. It was pretty unusual to do a full length portrait simply because that took a lot of trouble. Someone told me, and I can't remember who, and I don't know if it's true, that when these itinerant artists would go out on their circuit to do their paintings in the winter when they weren't going around, they would paint canvases and they would paint the clothes and the neck so that they'd have that part done, and then they go to your house and then they just have to do the face. I don't know if that's true, but that certainly most of the paintings are bust. They're only face paintings.
Huh, interesting. I guess that would speed things up when you're trying to paint as many as possible.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't have I don't see any other questions that anyone has submitted. So if you have other questions, one just popped up. But if someone didn't sign a painting, is there any way to tell who painted it? I know specialists and particular artists can make educated guesses, but what about lesser known painters? How would you find out who might have painted a given portrait? They say we have one from 1870 done apparently by an American artist.
Ooh, wow, that's good. Yeah, no, it's worth. It's hard. I mean, first of all, really good art curators, art historians can make guesses. And since I have no artistic ability at all, it's just they tell me about it and it's just gobbledygook. But basically, it's brush strokes, what kind of paint the person used, things like that are just way over my head. But there are ways to tell people, the art historians in this business might have a guess about who it was just generally from the look of the painting, but you have to get someone with an expertise.
Okay. Well, was there anything, so I don't, what I've noticed about you, Jim, is that you when you work on one thing, you tend to find something that kind of leads you down another path, which is awesome because you find these incredible things. Was there anything in researching this painter that you found that kind of maybe is leading to future research for you?
Yes, but I don't want.
You don't want to give it away. Okay.
Yeah, it's not that I want to give it away, but it gets into I see there's this thing. There's another question. Which
sure, yep. So, are there well-known limner painters in the Washington D.C. area today?
Okay, and so now this ties in. Sunday night, I had dinner with a woman who is a collateral descendant of John Stuart Curry. John Stuart Curry is a famous American painter of 1940s, 1950s. This woman is an abstract painter, and I said to her, "Why don't you do portraits?" I said, you can make a lot of money with portraits. If you could get John Stuart Curry to do your portrait, that'd be worth $10,000 or $20,000, and if his niece would be worth a lot of money too." And she said, "Well, I just don't like doing it." But you can go on Etsy and Craigslist and look for people who do paintings. It's fairly expensive. You can go to Alexandria waterfront, and those people sit out there on the waterfront on weekends and will do a charcoal of you. So you can find it, but it's a lot of people do it, but it's fairly expensive.
Okay. And my last question, because I don't see any other ones. Again, you can use the Q&A, so I'll ask my question, and if any more come up, we'll get to them. But you mentioned the dog painting. Were there any other paintings like that didn't really fit with the presentation that were entertaining or humorous that stood out to you?
Well, if you look at them long enough, like I did with that shoemaker painting, with the hayseed in his hat and the rat and the thing, you just wonder what the heck's going on. And I just sort of encourage my audience to do that, to go to, don't just walk by these paintings, stop and look at them and see what the heck's going on.
All right. And one thing I'd like to add is always read the plaque, because the plaque sometimes points out interesting little details, or you'll see like the cat that's, caught a mouse in the background type pictures. So,
Right.
well, with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Jim, thank you so much. This is fantastic. We will have a recording posted on Monday on our website. And if you, since you signed up, those of you who signed up will get an email with a link to register, to review that. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning, please help us out with our spring campaign to digitize our oral histories. You can visit our website at montgomeryhistory.org to find out more about that and many of our other programs. All right. Well, Jim, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.